"Your daughter isn't in that grave," the little boy said. Alexander Graves stopped with one hand on the marble headstone. The white roses slipped from his fingers and scattered across the wet grass. "What did you just say?" The boy stood at the edge of the cemetery path, small and soaked from the morning rain, his face half hidden beneath the hood of an old blue jacket. His sneakers were muddy. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, but his eyes did not look playful. They looked terrified. He pointed at the photograph in Alexander's hand. "That girl," he said. "She sleeps in my grandma's sewing room." Alexander looked down at the picture. Mia Rose Graves smiled back at him from behind the glass frame, missing one front tooth, red bracelet around her tiny wrist, sunlight in her hair. Then Alexander looked at the name carved into the stone. Mia Rose Graves, beloved daughter, 2015 to 2024. "That's impossible," Alexander whispered. "I buried her 2 years ago." The boy shook his head. "No, sir," he said softly. "You buried a box." For a moment, even the rain seemed to stop. Alexander Graves was a man who had frightened senators, destroyed rivals, and built one of the largest private empires in America. His name was printed on hospitals, airports, shipping terminals, and glass towers that rose over Manhattan like monuments to control. But in that cemetery, standing above his only child's grave, he did not look powerful. He looked like a father trying not to collapse. He stepped toward the boy. "What is your name?" "Malik Turner." "Malik," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you understand what you are saying to me?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know whose grave this is?" "Yes, sir." "Then why would you say something like that?" Malik looked at the photograph again. "Because she cries in her sleep," he said, "and sometimes she calls for somebody named Papa Bear." Alexander's face changed, only slightly, but enough. His fingers tightened around the silver frame until his knuckles went white. Nobody called him that anymore. Nobody had called him that since Mia was 6 years old and had climbed into his bed after a nightmare, wrapped both arms around his neck, and whispered, "You're not scary, Daddy. You're my Papa Bear." Alexander took another step. "How do you know that name?" Malik backed away. "I heard her say it. She don't talk much when she's awake, but when she sleeps, she talks." Behind Alexander, his driver stood beside the black Bentley, one hand already near his coat, unsure whether the child was a threat. Alexander lifted 2 fingers. The driver froze. "Tell me everything," Alexander said. Malik shook his head. "My grandma said not to talk to rich people unless they talk first." "I am talking first." "My grandma also said grief makes people mean." Alexander stared at him. For the first time in 2 years, something almost like a laugh escaped him. It broke halfway into pain. "Your grandmother is wise." "She is," Malik said. "And she said if I ever saw the man from the picture bringing flowers to the grave, I should ask him something." Alexander could barely breathe. "What?" Malik looked at the marble name, then at the wet roses, then at the photograph. "Sir, why do you keep bringing flowers to a girl who sleeps in my grandma's house?" Alexander looked again at the grave. For 2 years, he had come here every Sunday morning. For 2 years, he had placed white roses in the same silver vase. For 2 years, he had pressed his palm against that cold marble and apologized for not saving his daughter. He had spoken to dirt. He had begged forgiveness from stone. And now a child in muddy sneakers was telling him that the grave was not a resting place. It was evidence. "Take me to her," Alexander said. Malik did not move. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because last time a man in a black car came looking for her, she hid under the bed and didn't come out until midnight." Alexander's eyes sharpened. "What man?" "I don't know. Fancy coat, gray hair, smelled like cigarettes and lemon soap. He told my grandma the girl belonged to a private clinic." A private clinic. Alexander's blood went cold. 2 years earlier, Mia had died in a private clinic. At least, that was what he had been told. He had been in Geneva when the call came. Eleanor had cried so hard he could barely understand her. Arthur Langley, the family attorney, had told him there had been complications. Dr. Warren Blake had said the infection moved too quickly. By the time Alexander arrived, the coffin had already been sealed. For her dignity, they had said, for his protection, for the family's peace. Grief had made him obedient. Now Malik turned away, as if he had already said too much. Alexander reached toward him, then stopped himself. He lowered his hand slowly. "Malik," he said, "please." The boy looked back. This time, Alexander's voice was no longer the voice of a billionaire. It was the voice of a father on the edge of ruin. "I am not asking as Alexander Graves. I am asking as her father." Malik stared at him for a long moment. Then he said, "If you think the grave is the worst part, Mr. Graves, wait until my grandma shows you what was sewn inside her coat." He turned and walked toward the cemetery gate. Alexander looked at the marble name, the dead roses, and the empty place beneath the ground. For 2 years, he had thought grief was the worst thing a father could carry. He was wrong. The worst thing was realizing his grief had been useful to the people who stole his child. And for the first time in 2 years, Alexander Graves did not leave the cemetery mourning. He left it hunting. The Bentley moved slowly through a part of the city Alexander had never entered without tinted windows. Past pawn shops with metal bars over the glass, past corner stores with faded signs, past women waiting beneath bus shelters, past children jumping over puddles like rainwater, was not another inconvenience poverty had handed them. Malik sat in the back seat beside him, hands folded tightly in his lap. He did not touch the leather. He did not stare at the polished wood. He did not seem impressed. Alexander noticed. Most adults changed when they entered his world. They sat straighter, smiled harder, measured every sentence against the money around them. Malik only stared out at the street, looking like a boy trying to decide whether he had saved someone or betrayed someone. "Does she know who I am?" Alexander asked. Malik nodded. "She has your picture." Alexander's breath caught. "What picture?" "Old one. You're holding her on your shoulders. She keeps it in a shoebox." Alexander closed his eyes. Nantucket. Mia had been 4. Strawberry ice cream had melted down his linen shirt, and she had laughed because he pretended to be offended. Eleanor had hated that picture. She said he looked undignified. Mia said he looked happy. "Does she talk about me?" Malik hesitated. "She says you forgot her." Alexander turned. "No." Malik flinched. Alexander lowered his voice. "No," he repeated. "I never forgot her." "That's not what they told her." "Who?" Malik looked down. "The White Room people." The Bentley turned onto a narrow block lined with old houses, cracked sidewalks, and porches that sagged like tired shoulders. At the end stood a small yellow house with peeling paint, lace curtains, and a crooked porch crowded with flower pots. A woman stood in the doorway, Clara May Turner. She was not tall, but she carried herself like someone who had survived too much to be impressed by anything. Gray hair pulled back, brown cardigan buttoned to the throat, eyes steady enough to make Alexander's driver stop before being told. Malik got out. "Grandma," he said, guilt already in his voice. Clara May looked past him at Alexander. She did not smile. "So," she said, "you finally found your way off the hill." Alexander stepped into the rain. "Mrs. Turner, you know my name? Your grandson told me. And do you believe him?" Alexander looked toward the house. A curtain moved in one of the windows. Someone small had been watching. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he said. Clara May studied him. That answer seemed to matter. She opened the door wider. "Then come in quiet, and don't you dare make that child afraid in my house." Inside, the house smelled of lemon polish, cinnamon, old wood, and something warm simmering on the stove. It was small but cared for. The couch was faded but clean. The walls were full of family photographs, church calendars, paper angels, and children's drawings taped carefully along the hallway. Alexander stopped in front of one drawing. A house. A very large house. Gray stone. Tall windows. Iron gates. His house. Graves' house. But in the drawing, every window was colored black. Malik whispered, "She draws it like that every time." Clara May gave him a look. "That is not your story to tell in pieces, baby." Alexander followed her down the hallway. At the end was a small sewing room. A machine sat near the window. Folded fabric leaned against the wall. A narrow bed had been pushed beneath a shelf of thread and buttons. And there, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a pencil in her hand, was a girl. Small, thin, pale, her hair shorter than he remembered, her face older than any child's face should be. Alexander grabbed the doorframe. The room tilted. For 2 years, he had visited marble. For 2 years, he had spoken to dirt. For 2 years, he had believed he had buried the only light in his life. Mia lifted her head. Her eyes met his. Alexander made a sound that was not a word. "Mia!" The pencil slipped from her fingers. She did not run to him. She did not scream. She did not smile. She crawled backward until her shoulders touched the bed. The fear in her face hurt more than the grave. Alexander took 1 step into the room. Mia flinched, so he stopped. He lowered himself slowly to 1 knee, far enough away that she would not feel trapped. "Hi, sweetheart," he whispered. Mia stared at him. Her lips trembled. "You came." Alexander nodded. "I came." Her eyes filled with tears, but her body stayed rigid. "Did you stop looking for me?" The question entered him like a blade. Clara May looked away. Malik lowered his head. Alexander pressed 1 hand flat against the floor because he was afraid if he did not hold on to something, he would break apart in front of her. "No, sweetheart," he said. "They gave me a grave, and I believed the worst lie of my life." Mia's face twisted. "But she said you signed the paper." Alexander went still. "What paper?" "The paper that said I wasn't your little girl anymore." Clara May crossed to a cabinet and pulled out a folded gray coat. It was too large for a child. The fabric had been washed thin. The hem had been repaired by hand. "She was wearing this when I found her," Clara May said. "Middle of February, behind St. Luke's Church, curled up between 2 trash cans like she thought the whole world was hunting her." Alexander's jaw clenched. "She was burning with fever," Clara May continued. "Could barely stand. Malik thought she was a ghost." "I did," Malik whispered. "She kept saying not to take her back to the white room. Kept saying the lady with the pearl earrings would be angry." Alexander's eyes hardened. Eleanor wore pearl earrings every day. Not diamonds, not emeralds. Pearls. Because she believed pearls made women look innocent. Mia touched the red bracelet hanging from a string around her neck. Alexander saw it and nearly stopped breathing. He had given her that bracelet on her 7th birthday. A red woven band with a tiny gold bear charm. "You said red meant brave," Mia whispered. "It does. You said when I was scared, I should touch it and remember I was a Graves." Alexander shook his head. "No." Mia looked confused. He swallowed hard. "I was wrong. You were brave before I gave you my name. You were brave because you are Mia." The first tear slipped down her cheek. Clara May turned the coat sleeve inside out. "There was something sewn into the lining," she said. "I almost missed it." She opened a clumsy seam near the cuff and pulled out a plastic envelope. Inside was 1 folded document. No pile of evidence, no confusion, just 1 page. Alexander took it with shaking hands. Transfer of medical guardianship. Patient, Mia Rose Graves. Temporary guardian authorized, Eleanor Voss Graves. Emergency consent granted by biological parent, Alexander Theodore Graves. At the bottom was his signature, but it was not his signature. It was almost perfect. Almost. The G curved wrong. Arthur Langley had once joked that after 20 years as the Graves family attorney, he could sign Alexander's name better than Alexander could. Alexander had laughed. God help him, he had laughed. Mia whispered, "That's the paper." Alexander stared at the ink. His grief, his guilt, his obedience, his trust in expensive men with soft voices and legal seals. Everything collapsed into one freezing certainty. His daughter had not died. She had been taken, and someone had built a death certificate around the kidnapping. He looked up slowly. "Who gave this to you?" Mia shook her head. "I took it." "From where?" "The drawer in the white room, before I ran." Clara May said, "She wouldn't let me call the police. She thought they would take her back because the paper said Eleanor owned her." Alexander flinched at the word. Owned. Mia looked at him carefully. "She doesn't yell," she whispered. Alexander turned back to her. "Who?" Mia touched the red bracelet. "Eleanor. She smiles first. That's how you know something bad is coming." Something in Alexander went quiet, deadly quiet. Eleanor did not look like a monster. That was what made her dangerous. Monsters made children run. Eleanor made adults sign papers. Alexander folded the document with careful hands. Then he looked at Mia. "Sweetheart, I need to ask you something. You can say no." Mia said nothing. "Can I sit a little closer?" She hesitated, then gave one small nod. Alexander moved only a few inches, not enough to touch her, just enough to show her he would obey. Mia watched him with the seriousness of someone much older. "I thought you didn't want me sick." Alexander's face crumpled. "I wanted every version of you," he said. "Sick, scared, angry, silent, laughing. Every version, always." Mia made a tiny sound. Then she reached toward him. Alexander did not grab her. He opened his arms and let her decide. When she fell into him, he folded around her carefully, terrified of holding too tightly. Mia sobbed into his coat. Alexander pressed his cheek to her hair. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here. I'm here." Clara May stood in the doorway, eyes wet but spine straight. Malik wiped his face with his sleeve and pretended he had not. Outside, rain kept falling over the city. And across town, in a mansion built of limestone and lies, Eleanor Graves was preparing tea beneath a portrait of the little girl she had erased. Alexander did not call the police from Clara May's house. Not immediately. That was the first thing Jack Monroe told him when Alexander finally reached him from the porch. "Do not call local patrol," Jack said. "Do not confront Eleanor. Do not call Arthur Langley. Do not call the clinic. Do not even breathe this into your own house until I get there." Alexander stared through the lace curtain. Inside, Mia sat at Clara May's kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk. Malik was showing her a card trick and failing badly on purpose. "She's alive, Jack." On the other end, the retired detective went silent. Jack Monroe had known Alexander for 23 years. He had guarded him when Graves Global was still vulnerable. He had exposed embezzlers, found missing executives, and once pulled Alexander out of a burning warehouse. But he had never heard Alexander sound like this. "I believe you," Jack said. "You haven't seen her." "I don't need to. You don't break like that unless it's true." Alexander looked at the document on the counter. "They forged my signature." "Then somebody filed it. If somebody filed it, somebody processed it. If somebody processed it, there is a chain. They made me bury an empty coffin." This silence lasted longer. When Jack spoke again, his voice had changed. "Then this is not a family tragedy anymore. It is a criminal conspiracy." He arrived less than an hour later in an old black truck that looked out of place behind the Bentley. Jack Monroe was in his 60s, square-jawed, silver-haired, with the tired eyes of a man who had spent his life watching people lie and only sometimes watching them pay. He entered Clara May's house without arrogance. He removed his hat. "Ma'am?" Clara May nodded. "You police?" "Used to be. That can mean good or bad." "Yes, ma'am, it can." She studied him, then stepped aside. Jack examined the document at the kitchen table while Alexander sat near Mia, but not too near. Every few seconds, Alexander looked at her, as if afraid she would vanish if he blinked. Mia noticed. She did not smile, but she stopped hiding her hands inside her sleeves. Jack pointed to the forged signature. "Arthur." Alexander nodded. "I know." Jack looked at Clara May. "You found her in February?" "Yes." "Did anyone come looking?" Clara May's eyes narrowed. "One man, expensive coat, smooth voice. Tried to scare me with legal words. Alexander's gaze sharpened. What did he say? He said the child was a ward of a private medical facility. Said I could be charged with interference. Arthur Langley had never raised his voice in his life. Men like him did not need volume. They had letterheads, seals, signatures, and judges who remembered their names. Jack leaned forward. Did he give his name? No, but he had one of those cards rich men hand out when they want you to understand you are supposed to be afraid. Clara May opened a drawer and took out a business card. Arthur Langley. Langley, Pierce, and Holt. Family Council. Alexander stared at the card. Mia whispered, He came to the White Room too. Jack turned gently. What did he do there? Mia looked down. He brought papers. He told Dr. Blake I was not to be seen by anyone. He said once the trust moved, nobody would care where I was. The kitchen went silent. Malik stopped shuffling the cards. Jack wrote the sentence down. Alexander's voice was calm now. Too calm. Jack. Yes? Build the case. Jack nodded. But you promised me something. Alexander looked at him. You do not go near Eleanor alone. Alexander said nothing. Jack leaned closer. I mean it. People like this are most dangerous when they realize the dead can talk. That night, Alexander slept sitting upright in a chair outside the sewing room because Mia had asked if he could stay where she could see him. At 3 a.m, she woke screaming. Not loudly. That was the worst part. She screamed like someone who had learned not to make too much noise. Alexander was on his feet instantly. Mia was tangled in the blanket, eyes open but not seeing the room. No White Room, she gasped. Please, I won't tell. I won't tell. Alexander knelt beside the bed. Mia, sweetheart, it's Papa Bear. You're at Clara May's house. She pushed away from him. No needles. No needles. No clinic. No Eleanor. At that name, she froze. Then she began to cry. Clara May appeared in the doorway with a robe around her shoulders. Don't touch too fast, she said softly. Alexander lowered his hands. Clara May sat on the bed and hummed something old and gentle. Malik stood in the hallway, silent and frightened. Slowly, Mia returned to herself. She looked at Alexander. I forgot you came. I'll remind you every time, he said. In the dim light, Mia touched the red bracelet. They told me you put me away because I was too expensive to fix. Alexander's breath shook. Mia, I would have sold every building with my name on it to save you. Even the big one with the gold doors? A broken laugh escaped him. Especially that one. For the first time, the corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to keep him alive until morning. By the next morning, Jack had secured an emergency court order. The grave would be opened. Alexander stood in the cemetery beneath a black umbrella as the crew lifted the coffin from the wet earth. Arthur Langley arrived 20 minutes later in a charcoal suit, furious but controlled. Alexander, Arthur said, this is outrageous. Alexander did not look at him. My daughter is not in that grave. Arthur paused, only for half a second, but Jack saw it. Alexander did too. A man who believed Mia was dead would have said, What are you talking about? Arthur said nothing. Instead, he stepped closer and lowered his voice. Listen to me carefully. If that woman kept a child in her house without reporting it, I can make her look like the criminal before sunset. Alexander finally turned. The rain ran down the sharp lines of his face. Arthur continued, Poor woman, no legal resources, no documentation, a missing heiress in her home. A good prosecutor could make that look very ugly. Alexander smiled without warmth. That was your last mistake. Arthur's eyes flicked toward Jack. Jack said nothing. The workers placed the coffin on steel supports. Alexander remembered that coffin. He remembered standing beside it with Eleanor's hand on his arm, her black veil perfect, her perfume immaculate. He remembered asking to see Mia one last time. Dr. Blake had lowered his eyes and said the infection had made viewing impossible. Arthur had touched Alexander's shoulder. Let her remain beautiful in your memory. Alexander had nodded because grief had made him obedient. Now the screws came loose one by one, metal against wood. Every turn sounded like a confession. The workers stepped back. Jack looked at Alexander. "You don't have to." "Yes," Alexander said. "I do." He opened the coffin. Inside lay a folded white blanket, a child's dress, and beneath the satin, a rectangular metal weight fixed to the bottom of the box. No body, no child, no Mia. Alexander stood over the emptiness. The rain tapped the coffin lid. Arthur said softly, "There must be an explanation." Alexander turned to him. "There is." Arthur swallowed. Alexander stepped closer. "You wrote it." Arthur's lips tightened. "Careful. Grief has made you unstable." "No," Alexander said. "Grief made me useful. This is what I look like awake." Jack stepped between them before Alexander could do something satisfying and legally disastrous. "Mr. Langley," Jack said, "you should call your attorney." Arthur forced a smile. "I am an attorney," Jack smiled back. "Not for long." The empty coffin became the second pillar. The first was the forged document sewn into a little girl's coat. The second was the metal weight inside the coffin Alexander had mourned for 2 years. Jack did not flood Alexander with every receipt, every email, every medical note. He knew grief could drown in details. So he built the case like a blade, simple, sharp, impossible to explain away. The montage of evidence came quietly. A funeral home worker admitted the coffin arrived sealed and suspiciously light. A clinic staff member confirmed Mia had been alive after her official date of death. Bank transfers connected Eleanor's foundation to Hawthorne Vale. Draft trust amendments showed that if Mia remained legally dead and Alexander was declared emotionally unfit, Eleanor would gain practical control over assets reserved for the child. But Jack kept returning to the same 3 truths: a forged signature, an empty coffin, and the confession they still needed. Alexander wanted to confront Eleanor that night. Jack refused. "Not yet." She stood over an empty coffin and watched me break. "I know. She made my daughter believe I abandoned her. I know. I want to see her face when she realizes I know." Jack looked at him. "You will, but first she needs to believe she is still smarter than you." So Alexander returned to Graves' house alone. Eleanor was in the sunroom, wearing cream silk and pearl earrings, reading invitations for a charity gala in Mia's name. The obscenity of it almost made Alexander smile. "My God," Eleanor said, looking up. "Where have you been? I called the office. I called Arthur. I was worried sick." Alexander removed his gloves slowly. "Were you?" Her expression softened into the careful sadness he had mistaken for love for years. "Alex, the anniversary is approaching. I know this week destroys you." "Yes," he said. "It does." She rose and crossed to him. "You went to the cemetery again." "I did. You shouldn't torture yourself." "What should I do instead?" She touched his arm. "Let her go." Alexander looked down at her hand. 2 years ago, that hand had held his beside an empty coffin. "Let who go?" Pain moved across her face, beautiful and rehearsed. "Mia." He looked into her eyes. "Do you think she would want that?" "I think our little girl would want you to live." Our little girl. The words were theft. Alexander almost lost control. Instead, he walked to the tea table and lifted a porcelain cup. "Do you remember the last time you saw her?" Eleanor blinked. "What?" "Mia. Do you remember the last time you saw her alive?" "At breakfast," Eleanor said. "Before the clinic called." "The clinic called after breakfast?" "Yes, I believe so." "Strange." "What is?" "Mrs. Castillo remembers you ordering funeral clothes 6 hours before the clinic said Mia died." Color left Eleanor's face, then returned too quickly. "That poor woman is old. Grief distorts memory." Alexander nodded. "It does." Eleanor studied him. "What is this?" He set down the cup. I opened the coffin. Silence. Not horror, not outrage. Calculation. Then Eleanor whispered, "Why would you do that?" A mother who believed a child's body had been disturbed would have screamed. Eleanor asked why. Alexander smiled faintly. "That is the question, isn't it?" She stepped back. Alexander, you are frightening me. Am I? Yes, this obsession, this refusal to accept reality. The coffin was empty. Eleanor's lips parted. Her eyes filled with tears on command. That cannot be. Alexander watched the performance arrive too late. It was. She turned away, hand over her mouth. Then someone must have made a terrible mistake. Terrible, Alexander said, but not a mistake. The sunroom doors opened. Arthur Langley entered without being announced. That told Alexander everything. Alexander, Arthur said, smooth as polished stone. Eleanor called me. She said you were distressed. Alexander looked at his wife. You called him before I arrived? Eleanor froze. Arthur recovered for her. She called when you vanished overnight. Of course. Arthur approached. My friend, grief can reopen wounds in dangerous ways. Exhuming Mia's grave without consulting your family was deeply concerning. My family? Alexander asked. Yes. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice soft and poisonous. You were never a father, Alexander. You were a visitor with money. The words hit harder than he expected, because guilt already lived there. Because he had missed school mornings, piano recitals, doctor appointments. Because he had believed expensive security was the same thing as protection. Because some part of him had always feared Mia had needed him more than he had known how to be present. Eleanor saw the wound open, so she pressed deeper. You flew in with gifts and flew out with apologies. You gave her bracelets, bears, ponies, houses, but not time. And now you want to pretend grief makes you noble? Arthur said quietly. Eleanor. But she was no longer performing sorrow. She was enjoying the cut. You were easy to manage after she died, she whispered. Because guilt does half the work if you know where to touch. Alexander lowered his gaze. For 1 second, Eleanor thought she had won. Then he reached inside his coat. He placed a photograph on the table. Mia, alive. Sitting at Clara May's kitchen table, red bracelet around her neck, sunlight touching her hair, Malik beside her, holding up a crooked card trick. Eleanor looked at the photograph. For the first time in 2 years, the perfect widow's face broke. Not with joy, not with disbelief, with fear. Arthur went completely still. Alexander watched them both. She is thinner now, he said. But you knew that, Eleanor whispered. Where did you get this? Not, is that Mia? Not, she's alive? Not, thank God. Where? That was how Alexander knew she had always known. Arthur stepped toward the table. Alexander placed one hand over the photo. No, Arthur's voice dropped. You have no idea what that child may have been told. That child, Alexander said, is my daughter. Eleanor's face twisted. If that girl is in some poor woman's house, you need to be very careful. People will believe what the paperwork says. They will believe the woman took her. They will believe the boy was coached. They will believe grief made you desperate enough to see your daughter in any damaged child with brown hair. Alexander looked at Arthur. There it is. Arthur's eyes narrowed. What? The plan. Eleanor took a breath, then another. Her control was slipping. You have no idea what I protected you from, she said. Alexander stared at her. Arthur snapped. Eleanor! No, she said. No, I am tired of being treated like the villain in a house built around a dead woman and a spoiled child. She was a child, Alexander said. She was an heir, Eleanor hissed. An heir with voting shares, a trust, and a father who became useless every time she coughed. Arthur grabbed her arm. Stop talking! Alexander looked at Arthur's hand, then at Eleanor. Keep going. Eleanor laughed, ugly now. You think she would have been safe in this world? Board members whispering in her ear, trustees using her, kidnappers watching school gates? I gave her care. You gave her a locked room. I gave her survival. You gave me a grave. Eleanor's mouth trembled. You would have chosen her over everything. Alexander's answer came without hesitation. Yes. That one word destroyed something in her. Her eyes hardened. Then you have your answer. Arthur turned toward the door. Alexander said, Jack. The library doors opened. Jack Monroe stepped inside with 2 officers and a woman from the district attorney's office. Arthur stopped walking. Eleanor turned slowly. Jack lifted a small recorder from his coat pocket. "Mrs. Graves," he said, "you may want to stop helping us." Arthur's face went gray. Alexander picked up Mia's photograph and slid it back inside his coat. "I believed the worst lie of my life," he said, "but I will not make the same mistake twice." The confrontation became the 3rd pillar, not because Eleanor confessed to everything in clean legal language. People like Eleanor never handed over truth neatly, but she had revealed knowledge, motive, intent, and most importantly, the threat they had planned to use next. Blame Clara May, discredit Malik, call Alexander unstable, turn Mia from a stolen child into a confused one. Jack moved fast after that. The district attorney froze Eleanor's access to the Mia Rose Trust before sunrise. Graves Global's board received a sealed packet before the markets opened. Hawthorne Vale's records were subpoenaed by noon, and Arthur Langley did what arrogant men do when they finally understand paper can burn. He ran. Arthur was already at the private terminal when his phone stopped working. At first, he thought it was a signal issue. Then the airline clerk stopped smiling. Then the customs officer took one step back. Then Jack Monroe walked through the glass doors, holding the one document Arthur had forgotten to destroy. It was not dramatic looking. That was the problem. No gold seal, no confession, just an internal funeral home invoice for a custom metal counterweight, attached to a sealed coffin under infectious protocol. Authorized by Arthur Langley, initialed in blue ink, delivered the night before Mia's funeral. Arthur stared at it. For the first time in his life, he looked common. A man in an expensive suit, with sweat at his temples, and nowhere elegant left to stand. Jack stopped in front of him. "Going somewhere?" Arthur smiled thinly. "This is harassment." "No," Jack said. "This is gravity." 2 federal agents moved behind him. Arthur lifted his chin. "You have no idea how many judges I know." Jack leaned closer. "And you have no idea how many of them already saw the coffin." Arthur's mask cracked, only for a second, but enough. He looked toward the jet waiting outside the glass. The engines were still humming. The stairs were still down. Freedom sat less than 200 feet away. Then one of the agents took his passport. Arthur said, "I want my attorney." Jack smiled. "I thought you were one." They cuffed him in the private terminal beneath soft lights and polished floors, while 3 billionaires and a senator pretended not to watch. Arthur Langley had spent his life destroying people with documents. In the end, he was stopped by one he forgot to shred. Dr. Warren Blake fell next, quieter and uglier. He tried to claim he had acted under legal instruction. He said Mia's isolation was medically necessary. He said the forged guardianship document had looked authentic. But once Arthur was in custody and Eleanor's accounts were frozen, the clinic staff began remembering things. A nurse remembered Mia asking if her father had called. A driver remembered taking Eleanor to Hawthorne Vale after midnight. A records clerk remembered being told to change Mia's status from long-term observation to deceased archive. The clinic did not collapse loudly. It collapsed the way rotten houses do. One wall at a time. Then all at once. Hawthorne Vale was shut down pending investigation. Dr. Blake lost his license before trial. Eleanor tried one final performance. She claimed Alexander had lost his mind from grief. She claimed the girl was being coached. She claimed Clara May had hidden a wealthy child for money. That mistake cost her the room. At the custody and emergency protection hearing, the judge listened to lawyers argue for nearly an hour before Mia stood. Alexander reached for her hand. She squeezed once, then let go. "I want to speak," she said. The judge softened his voice. "Miss Graves, you do not have to." "Yes," Mia said, "I do." The courtroom went silent. Eleanor sat at the defense table in gray. No pearls. Maybe her attorney had advised it. Maybe she finally understood innocence was no longer a costume she could wear. Mia looked at the judge, not at Eleanor. I ran because the clinic said my dad didn't want me. I ran because they kept locking the door. I ran because Mr. Langley said once the trust moved, nobody would care where I was. Arthur closed his eyes. Mia continued. Mrs. Turner didn't ask me for money. She didn't know my last name at first. She gave me soup and socks, and she put a chair under the bedroom door because I was scared someone would come in while I slept. Clara May sat in the second row, hands folded tightly in her lap. Mia's voice trembled, but it did not break. She saved me because I was a child, not because I was rich. That sentence did what all the legal filings had not. It made the room ashamed. Within weeks, the court voided Mia's death certificate. Mia Rose Graves was legally recognized as alive. Her trust was protected under independent supervision. Alexander regained full parental custody. Eleanor lost access to Graves' accounts, the family estate, the trust, and every board position she had touched. Arthur Langley was formally charged with forgery, fraud, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and unlawful custody manipulation. Dr. Warren Blake became the center of a widening criminal investigation. But the first night after the custody order, Mia did not sleep at Graves' house. She slept in Clara May's sewing room. Alexander slept in the chair outside the door. Healing did not care how rich he was. It moved slowly. Some days, Mia laughed in Clara May's kitchen while Malik taught her card tricks. Some days, she froze if a door closed too loudly. Some nights, she asked Alexander the same question again and again. You didn't sign me away? Never. You looked for me? I looked in the wrong place, he said. But I never stopped loving you. You believe me? Always. Trust did not return like lightning. It returned like sunrise. Slowly. Quietly. One morning at a time. When Alexander finally asked Clara May what she needed, she crossed her arms before he finished the sentence. No. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to give me money. Yes. No. Alexander looked at her small kitchen, the chipped mug in her hand, the floorboards that creaked beneath every step. Mrs. Turner, you saved my daughter. I opened a door. That is more than I did. You did what people like you do, she said. You trusted people with titles. Alexander absorbed that without defending himself. Yes. And now you want to pay me so your guilt has somewhere to sit. He almost smiled. That is partly true. At least you're honest. But not all of it, he said. I am not offering charity. I am asking for partnership. Clara May narrowed her eyes. What kind of partnership? A foundation in Mia's name, for missing children, for children trapped by fraudulent guardianships, for families who cannot afford to fight official paperwork. And where do I come in? You tell us when we are helping people and when we are just making rich donors feel clean. For the first time, Clara May laughed. A small laugh, but real. You want me to sit in a room full of billionaires and tell them no? Alexander looked at her. I suspect you would enjoy it. Mia appeared in the doorway, red bracelet visible at her throat. Can Malik help too? Malik's voice came from behind her. I'm good at finding stuff. Clara May raised an eyebrow. You are good at being nosy. That is finding stuff. Alexander crouched in front of him. You found my daughter. Malik looked down, suddenly shy. I just told the truth. Alexander shook his head. No. You told the truth to a man everyone else was afraid to hurt. That takes courage. The Mia Rose Foundation opened 6 months later in a renovated building near St. Luke's Church, not far from the alley where Clara May had found Mia trembling behind the trash cans. There were no marble floors. Clara May had insisted on that. Children running from trouble do not need floors they are afraid to step on, she said. So the building had warm wood, soft chairs, pale yellow walls, lawyers upstairs, investigators in the back, and a kitchen that always had soup. On opening day, Alexander arrived with white roses. Mia saw them and went still. For 2 years, white roses had belonged to a grave. Alexander noticed immediately. I can throw them away, he said. Mia looked at the flowers, then at Clara May, then at Malik, then at her father. No, she said, we can change what they mean. Together, they placed the roses in a vase beside the entrance, not beside a photograph of a dead child, beside a sign that read, "For every child the world stopped looking for too soon." That evening, Alexander returned to the cemetery one last time. Not alone. Mia came with him. So did Malik, Clara May, Mrs. Castillo, and Jack Monroe, who claimed he was only there for security but carried flowers anyway. The false headstone had been removed. In its place was a small flat marker with no dates, only one sentence. "Here lies the lie that could not hold her." Mia stood in front of it for a long time. Alexander waited. Finally, she said, "I don't want to come here again." "Then we won't." "Do you want to?" Alexander looked at the empty ground. For 2 years, he had poured love into this place because he thought it was all he had left. Now it felt like a locked room. "No," he said. "I want to go home." Mia reached for his hand. "Which one?" Alexander looked toward Clara May. The old woman pretended not to hear, but her eyes softened. Then he looked back at Mia. "Whichever one has you in it." Later that night, the Bentley stopped in front of Clara May Turner's small yellow house with the crooked porch. Alexander stepped out, carrying white roses, not for a grave this time, but for the woman who had opened her door when every official document in the world said she should close it. Clara May stood on the porch, arms crossed. "You keep bringing flowers, Mr. Graves." Alexander looked at the house, at the sewing room window, at Malik laughing inside, at Mia sitting at the kitchen table, safe enough to leave her back to the door. "Yes," he said, "but now I bring them to the truth." Clara May took the roses. "Come in before the soup gets cold." Alexander smiled. For 2 years, Alexander Graves brought flowers to a lie carved in stone. Now he brought them to a small house with a crooked porch, where the woman who had almost nothing had saved the only thing he could not buy back. Because money can build a mansion, but sometimes only mercy can bring a child home.